Hello again. In recent years, we've all fallen into the habit of pretending there was nothing special about the civilization of Europe and Asia. In order that black pupils of schools in Britain and America don't feel left out or excluded, a cottage industry has sprung up which is dedicated to inventing supposed cultures and civilizations in Africa, which were apparently doing wonderfully before the white colonialists came along and spoilt it all. It's all a pack of fairy tales, of course, but nobody really wants to be the one to point out that the emperor has no clothes on. Let's start with an ancient culture which we are told existed in Africa in about the 12th or 13th century AD, the medieval period in Europe. Here's what the civilization of the ancestors of the Shona people have bequeathed to us. It's from the site of Great Zimbabwe in Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe as it is now called. And for comparison, here's the legacy of European architecture from the same period. Spot the difference. In the whole continent of Africa, all that remains of the past cultures are a few dry stone walls. You might want to compare these with a few other examples of European and Chinese architecture from the period in your own time. Still, it might be argued, building's not everything, is it? What about art? What about it? Here's some example of African art for the first 1500 years of the Christian era. The first two examples are sculptures from Cameroon from roughly the 15th century. The other one was a knock head from what is now Nigeria, probably about the time of the birth of Christ. For comparison, let's again look at what Italy and China were producing at the same time. Curious, no? The art of Africa at that time was the kind of thing which might easily be knocked out by a high school pupil in Britain or America during an art lesson. The sculpture of Europe and China at that time is still, some would say, unsurpassed. The wonder and masterpieces of sculpture like that is now widely denigrated and mocked, and it's falsely asserted that African culture is the equal to anything in Europe. So it is that in British schools, African drumming is hugely popular, and the idea of attempting to master the violin or piano is regarded as being akin to cultural imperialism. As for the idea of teaching children to appreciate classical music of the European style, which was once routinely done even in the roughest schools, the very notion is today preposterous. The whole of the African civilization trick began, like the Mary Seacole myth, in the 1980s. Books published before that time make no mention at all of any of these cultures. Here's a standard work by Arthur Cotterill, published in 1980. Yeah? No mention at all of any of those so-called cultures. Nothing about Africa, in fact. One possible explanation is that Eurocentric historians and archaeologists have suppressed information about these empires. Another would be that they are mostly late 20th century inventions. One clue as to which these is a correct explanation is easily seen. If you walk around London or Rome, you're constantly tripping over evidence of past civilization. 2,000-year-old walls, amphitheatres, 1,000-year-old castles and churches. The evidence is everywhere. In the whole of Africa, though, there is nothing but a few tumble-down dry stone walls. For all this talk of mighty empires and lost kingdoms, There are no buildings or roads or written records. Nothing really but a few pieces of crude artwork. But wait, I hear doubters say, what about Mali? Surely there's ancient buildings there. What about the Great Mosque? We hear a lot about that Great Mosque. I'll come back to that in a minute. Mali is a perfect example of how this gag is being worked. I sometimes wonder if some of the more unpleasant comments on this channel of mine are caused by people who don't like to be shown how a trick is worked. I'm like one of those spoilsports who explains how some famous magician pulls off his illusions and other stunts. It can be very annoying. Mali is really the poster boy of these ancient African civilizations, the one that everybody mentions. The strange thing is though, no one really seems to have any evidence for the civilization there. It's left no buildings, books, music, art, philosophy, nothing of that sort. Indeed, there's no trace at all of this supposed civilization. So how's the story of Mali and its famous old mosque arisen? There's several ways that this has happened. One is bare assertion, simply claiming that there was a huge civilization in Africa centred around Mali. Another is by mocking up imaginative reconstructions of what such a famous civilization might actually have looked like. When one is aware of awkward facts, such as that no building in Mali is older than 100 years old or so, after the French colonialists began building, in fact, it's possible to be a little bit vague and misleading in such a way that gullible fools won't realise what you're doing. Let's look at this Great Mosque of Jen, which so many people seem to mention as being a relic of an ancient civilization. Viewers who don't want to learn uncomfortable facts about the so-called Mali Empire should look away now. The Wikipedia article on Mali's Great Mosque is a masterpiece of deceit. It says that the dating of the Great Mosque's construction is obscure. Well, this is a plain lie. It was built in 1907. It was the French who arranged for it to be constructed, not the Africans. The article makes reference to the 17th century and talks of imperial Malian architecture and the style of Sudanese Sahelian architecture. You see what's being done here? By talking in these terms about architectural styles and mentioning the 17th century, it's being made to sound as though Mali was comparable to Europe, the way that we talk about 17th century buildings in Europe and about Renaissance architecture or Romanesque or Baroque and so on. Let's have a look at a photograph of the mosque as it actually was when the Europeans arrived in Mali. It's a pile of mud. The French thought that while they were building their own buildings in the area, it might be nice to have a new mosque. It would make the place look a bit tidier than just having a heap of mud in the middle of town. So they designed a mosque. They thought up a completely spurious style of architecture, invented it in fact, and they built the mosque. The locals weren't that keen. They used to pray out in the open air. They couldn't be bothered building a new mosque, but the French arranged them in forced labour gangs and then built the mosque out of mud, by the way. Here it is, the mosque that the French built in 1907. In such a way myths are made. I've probably been going on a bit too long about this subject, so I'll stop and return to it at a later date. For now though, I will remark that until the coming of Europeans, there wasn't much in the way of civilization in Africa. No writing, no wills, and the only buildings were made of mud. It's little wonder that attempts are now being made to disguise this unpalatable fact and provide sub-Saharan Africa with a highly romanticised and wholly imaginary history of fallen empires and lost civilizations.